The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. I first wrote those words in 1937, then again in different forms across 17 years of writing. The road kept returning to my work because it kept returning to my imagination. Some images arrive unexpectedly and refuse to leave until one has followed them to their end. What is The Lord of the Rings? One book, published in 3 volumes, certainly, but conceived as a single work. Publishers divided it for practical reasons: paper shortages after the war, printing costs, uncertainty about whether anyone would read something so long and so strange. I never thought of it as a trilogy. Its central story concerns a hobbit named Frodo Baggins, who inherits a ring that must be destroyed before its maker can recover it. To destroy it, he must carry it into the enemy's own land and cast it into the fire where it was forged. A simple task, one might say, and quite impossible. But the book is not only about a ring. It is about friendship, about sacrifice, about the burden of carrying responsibilities one never asked for, and about the curious fact that history is often changed not by the mighty, but by people who never imagined themselves important at all. It is also at its heart about the preservation of ordinary things that seem unremarkable until they are threatened. Gardens, meals shared among friends, a peaceful countryside, the freedom to live quietly. The great adventure exists in part so that such things may endure. Where were you when you wrote this? What had happened to you? I was 24 years old when I arrived at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. I had married Edith only a few months earlier. I remember feeling that leaving her behind was a kind of death. The Somme consumed an entire generation. Many of the young men I knew never returned. All but one of my closest friends did not come home. I survived because I contracted trench fever and was sent back to England. There is nothing heroic in that. Merely fortunate. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory of the world wars. I should say that plainly. I disliked allegory, particularly the kind that attempts to reduce a story to a code waiting to be deciphered. Yet experiences leave traces, and one cannot help that. The desolation of Mordor, the ruin of forests, the long marches through darkness beside companions who are afraid and continue nevertheless. Such things do not emerge from nowhere. 20 years passed before I began the book in earnest. I was 45 when The Hobbit was published in 1937, and my editor asked for more. I completed the principal narrative a decade after that, during which time another war engulfed the world. My son served in the Royal Air Force. Cities burned. And once again, humanity demonstrated what it was capable of when power became detached from wisdom. You invented entire languages for this world. Why? Because the languages came first. I was a philologist. Languages fascinated me long before stories did, and I began inventing them as a boy. Eventually, I discovered that a language requires speakers. The speakers require a history. The history requires legends, and the legends require a world. Many people imagine that I built Middle-earth in order to tell a story. The truth is almost the reverse. The stories emerged because Middle-earth was already there, waiting to be explored. Tell us about Frodo, and why a small creature carries the most dangerous object in the world. Frodo is a hobbit, a small creature from a quiet land. He enjoys books, meals, gardens, and ordinary comforts. He possesses no remarkable military skill, no great political ambition, no desire for glory. Why Frodo? I'm not certain anyone in the story fully knows. Gandalf would have called it providence. The ring seeks power. Indeed, it offers power. and those most accustomed to wielding it are often most vulnerable to its promises. Frodo possessed no great desire for dominion, and perhaps that helped him for a time. Though only for a time. The ring worked upon him as it would upon anyone, and by the end he could no longer willingly surrender it. The story does not suggest that goodness grants immunity to corruption, only that humility may endure somewhat longer before yielding to it. Long enough, perhaps, to reach the end of the road. Who travels with him? 9 companions leave Rivendell. The Fellowship of the Ring. A wizard, an elf, a dwarf, 2 men, and 4 hobbits. One of those men is Aragorn, heir to an ancient kingship he has spent his life in deliberate obscurity avoiding. The other is Boromir, a brave and noble man whose virtues prove insufficient against temptation. The Fellowship does not remain together. That was important to me. The company that begins the journey cannot complete it as a company. The world is too large, the burdens too different, the roads too many. Samwise Gamgee remains beside Frodo to the very end. Readers often describe him as heroic, and I think he would be embarrassed by that. He is afraid constantly, yet he continues, not because he believes himself brave, but because someone he loves needs him, and because he never loses sight of what is being defended. The goal is neither a throne nor renown. It is the chance to return home, to tend his garden, to live an ordinary life in peace. That manner of courage has always seemed to me more convincing than fearlessness. Who is Gollum? Gollum is in many ways the ring's greatest achievement. He was once an ordinary creature, a hobbit. He found the ring, murdered for it, and over centuries it consumed nearly everything he had been. He becomes pitiable, terrible, and sometimes both at once. There is a moment when he looks upon Frodo sleeping and almost repents. Almost. That word matters. Many readers expect stories to culminate in a final triumph of will. Mine does not. At the crack of doom, Frodo fails. He claims the ring. The quest appears lost. Yet Gandalf had long suspected that Gollum still had a part to play, though even he could not have guessed how the tale would end. Bilbo's pity, extended years earlier when he chose not to kill Gollum in the dark, may have seemed a small thing at the time. It proved more powerful than wisdom, strength, or planning. Gollum takes the ring and falls with it into the fire. I thought carefully about that ending. It has always seemed to me nearer the truth than a victory won simply by strength of will. Providence, as Gandalf would say. What does the book say about power? The desire for power and the fitness to wield it are rarely found in equal measure. Aragorn is the rightful king of Gondor, and has long known what that inheritance would require. Yet he does not seek authority for its own sake. He spends years in obscurity, years in service, preparing himself for a responsibility that may never come. Boromir provides the contrast. He loves his people sincerely. His motives are not selfish. And yet he reaches for the ring, because he believes his goodness will protect him from its corruption. He is mistaken. One of the virtues I most admired in the old northern literature was the courage to continue when victory appeared impossible, not because success was likely, but because the thing itself was worth doing. Aragorn possesses that quality. So does Sam. Indeed, many of the finest characters in the story share it. What happens when they come home? The Shire has been damaged and occupied while the hobbits were away. They return home to discover that saving the world did not save their own country. That task remains for them. Many adaptations omit this chapter, and I understand why. The great battle has already ended, the ring is gone, and the audience feels the story is finished. But for me it was essential, because journeys do not end when one returns home. The traveler has changed, and often home has changed as well. The final task is learning to live again in the place one left behind. In some respects, this chapter reveals the purpose of the entire adventure. The Shire was never merely the place from which the story began. It was the thing worth preserving, humble, local, imperfect, and beloved. You were a devout Catholic. Is this a Christian story? I do not think mythology works by simple equivalences, and the book is not an allegory. Gandalf is not a cipher to be decoded, nor is the ring merely a symbol standing in place of something else. Yet I was a Christian, a Catholic, and stories inevitably reflect the convictions of their authors. Mercy, sacrifice, humility, grace, the idea that the seemingly insignificant person may prove essential. These themes were not borrowed from Christianity. They were already part of how I understood the world. I once described The Lord of the Rings as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. I meant that its deepest assumptions about good and evil, about corruption and grace, arise from that vision of reality. I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden turn from apparent disaster to unexpected grace. The destruction of the ring is perhaps the clearest example of it in the book. It could not have been planned. It could not have been forced. It required everything that came before it, including every act of mercy that seemed at the time like weakness. Why should someone read The Lord of the Rings today? Because it takes evil seriously, and goodness seriously, without simplifying either. The modern world often imagines that every problem yields to sufficient power, sufficient force, sufficient control. The ring suggests otherwise. Some instruments corrupt whoever uses them, and the question is not merely who possesses power, but what possessing it does to the soul. And the book takes ordinary people seriously, genuinely, as people rather than as symbols of an idea. The fate of Middle-earth rests not in the hands of its greatest warriors, but in those of creatures most would overlook. There is something hopeful in that, though not comfortable. Frodo succeeds, and yet he does not fully recover. The wound the ring made in him cannot be healed in the world where it was made, and he must eventually leave. Victories are real in my story, but they are rarely complete. That seemed to me the most truthful ending I could offer. I dedicated the work to the Inklings, the friends who sat in a pub in Oxford and listened to drafts and chapters and false starts with a patience that now seems remarkable. Lewis in particular. Without him, I am not certain I would have completed it. We disagreed about many things toward the end, but gratitude survives disagreement. The world you built is vast, but where did it begin for you, personally? Long before The Lord of the Rings, I was writing the legends that would eventually become the mythology of Middle-earth. Among them was the tale of Beren and Luthien, a mortal man, an immortal woman, and a love strong enough to alter the fate of both. The mythology grew, and the world expanded around it, yet somehow it always led back to one memory. Luthien was inspired by Edith. Many years earlier, I watched her dancing in a woodland glade filled with hemlocks. I never forgot it. That moment entered the stories and remained there. When Edith died in 1971, I asked that a single word be placed beneath her name, Luthien. When I died 2 years later, my family placed a single word beneath mine, Beren. You see, the Shire was worth saving because it was particular. A specific place, with specific people, and a way of life that could not be replaced by anything grander or more powerful. That is what Sam understood, and what Frodo was fighting for, even when he could no longer remember it clearly himself. Most people, I think, have such a place. Something ordinary, something easily overlooked, something that seems insignificant until it is threatened. Perhaps that is why stories of distant kingdoms matter. They remind us what is precious in our own, and what may be worth walking into darkness to preserve.